Moscow is experiencing one of the longest and darkest nights in its modern history. The war in Ukraine is no longer being fought along the border, but right in Russia's capital over the heads of 20 million people. The wave of attacks that began in the capital in the first days of January peaked on the night of January 3rd to 4th. According to independent sources and radar data, Ukraine launched more than 200 UAVs targeting Moscow. This was not an attack, it was an air blockade. Faced with this intensity, the Kremlin was forced to activate the most radical measure in its military doctrine, the Kover Plan. The meaning of this plan is clear. Moscow airports are not safe when the covert alarm is sounded. And that is exactly what happened. The moment the order was given, Russia's gateways to the world, Vnukovo, Domodedovo, Zhukovsky, and Sheremetyevo airports turned into concrete music traps. The attacks did not stop. They came in waves. Even as daylight broke, the sounds of explosions in the skies over Moscow did not cease. However, the real destruction was not in the buildings, but inside the airport terminals. Moscow's airspace was closed not only to drones, music, but also to its own citizens. The timing of this crisis was also quite noteworthy. January is Orthodox Christmas music and New Year holidays for Russia. In other words, we are talking about a period of peak passenger traffic. The fact that Russians faced such a crisis during this period intensified the situation even more. Huge crowds formed in front of the check-in counters with passengers asking airline staff about the situation. A video taken by a passenger on their cell phone clearly showed the crisis situation at Moscow's airports. Since the first days of January, it is claimed that exactly 20,000 passengers have been stranded in Moscow terminals. These people cannot go anywhere because the planes are not taking off. They cannot return to the city because the roads are reportedly closed due to weather conditions. The terminals are a scene of chaos. Hotels are full. VIP lounges are overflowing. There is only one option left to spend the night at the airports. Airport management may be unprepared for a crisis of this magnitude. This is a possibility that deepens the crisis at Moscow airports. But there is only one message that remains unchanged on the screens: flight cancellation or continuous delay. The situation is particularly tragic for transit passengers. Without visas, they are likely prohibited from leaving the terminal and entering the city. These people are stuck behind passport control in limbo. No showers, no beds, no fresh air. These 20,000 people are thought to have become victims of the crisis created by Putin's air defense war. For them, Moscow airport is no longer a transportation hub, but has turned into a labyrinth with no exit. Mayor Soan may give victory speeches saying, "We shot down 30 drones. We shot down 50 drones." The Russian Defense Ministry may say everything is under control. But for the passengers stranded at Moscow's airports, there is no control whatsoever. For them, the state may have become not a protective force, but a wall that imprisons them in the terminal, leaves them music-hungry, and withholds information. The crisis also has a massive financial and operational dimension that is invisible, but is eating away at the Russian economy. The graphs on Flight Radar 24 showing planes circling over Moscow with dwindling fuel reserves were not surprising. Music reports that planes unable to land in Moscow and diverted to Nizhny Novgorod, Kazan, and St. Petersburg filled the parking lots at those small airports were also to be expected. Closing airports is not just locking a door, it is toppling dominoes. Over 500 canceled flights. If you think the cost is limited to ticket refunds, you're mistaken. Hundreds of planes were unable to land in Moscow due to the covert order while in the air. Diverting these planes to alternate airports costs billions of rubles. However, the parking areas at these small airports were full. Their capacity exceeded. Planes were stranded on runways and taxiways. Passengers couldn't be disembarked for hours because there were no boarding bridges or buses to transport them. Worse still is crew scheduling. In aviation, pilots and cabin crews have legal flight time limits. The shifts of crews waiting in Moscow skies or landing in other cities have likely been exceeded due to delays. So, even if the airspace were to open now, it might be impossible to find a crew legally allowed to fly those planes. Canceling one flight can cascade and disrupt the next 10 flights for that aircraft. Russian airlines, already struggling with sanctions and a spare parts crisis, could now be on the verge of operational bankruptcy. Fuel costs have doubled, ground services have collapsed, and cargo transportation has stopped. Moscow is the logistical heart of Russia, and right now that heart is in arrhythmia. This crisis will likely lead to the logos of Russian airlines such as Aeroflot and S7 and falling stock charts. So where are the billion-dollar S-400s and the legendary Pantsir systems? How is Moscow, protected by the world's most dense air defense network, so helpless against simple motorized toys that it has to close its airports? The answer lies in Ukraine's asymmetric saturation tactic. First, Russian radars, such as the 96L6E and Nebo SVU, are designed to detect massive bomber aircraft and ballistic missiles. Ukrainian drones, however, are made of composite materials, have a very low radar signature, and most importantly, fly very low. They glide at tree level between buildings. Russian radars filter these out, mistaking them for ground clutter, i.e., flocks of birds or traffic noise. The giants cannot see what is at their feet. Second, and most importantly, is the security dilemma. When 200 drones attack simultaneously, as on January 4th, Russian air defense computers become unable to distinguish between targets, the system reaches saturation. And with civilian aircraft in the sky, firing air defense batteries is like playing Russian roulette. There is a high risk that a heat-seeking missile or radar lock will lock onto an Airbus full of passengers instead of a drone. This is the equation that leaves the Kremlin helpless. If you fire missiles to defend Moscow, you risk hitting your own civilian aircraft. If you don't fire, the drones will fall on the Kremlin. The only solution? Kill civilian aviation. The Kover Plan. Russia is forced to cut the lifeline of its own economy to stop Ukrainian drones. From a technological perspective, we see that Russia's electronic warfare EW capabilities have also reached their limits. GPS jamming around Moscow is forcing civil aviation to fly blind. Taxis with non-functioning navigation systems, civilian drones losing their way, and most importantly, passenger planes unable to obtain reliable data during landing approaches. Russia is sabotaging its own digital infrastructure to stop drones. Trying to see the enemy by blinding your own city is the clearest technological confession of desperation. According to international media reports, GPS deviations around Moscow are so high that flight safety is left to chance. This increases the risk of a friendly crash every second, if not friendly fire. The inadequacy of air defense systems leaves the Russian command in a deadly dilemma. The short blanket problem. Russia's air defense systems are limited. If you withdraw the Pantsir and Tur systems from the front lines to protect Moscow, the heart of the regime and the comfort of the elite, you leave your troops, ammunition depots, and command centers on the Ukrainian front, exposed to HIMS and Storm Shadow missiles. But if you keep the systems at the front, this time your capital will be paralyzed, your airports will close, and your prestige will be destroyed. The Ukrainian General Staff is forcing Russia to make exactly this decision. Every drone attack on Moscow actually asks Russian generals this question: who will you sacrifice? The military on the front lines or the perception in Moscow? It appears that the Kremlin has not yet been able to provide an answer, and this indecision is creating vulnerabilities at both ends of the system. So, as we can see, the air attacks on Moscow have proven that Ukraine does not need to destroy the Kremlin to paralyze Russia. It is enough to shut down Moscow's airspace, lock down its logistics, and trap its people in panic at the terminals with just a few hundred cheap drones. This is a much deeper psychological and strategic destruction than physical damage. When Moscow's airspace closed, Russia's claim to great power status was also abandoned on the floor of those terminals, like abandoned suitcases. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. The scenes of people in the terminals are merely a preview of a much larger catastrophe to come. The truly devastating impact of Moscow's skies closing is felt not in the passenger lounges, but in the cargo hangars and Russia's sensitive supply chains. This is the invisible breaking point of the Russian economy. Modern warfare is waged not only with ammunition on the front lines, but also with microchips in factories, medicines in hospitals, and spare parts in industry. Russia was already largely cut off from global logistics networks due to Western sanctions. The last and most critical lifeline remaining was gray import goods transported via friendly countries and usually by air. Semiconductors, vital drugs such as insulin, critical sensors for industrial machinery, these arrive by plane, not by train, because they are high value, small in volume, and critical in urgency. Moscow airports are a massive hub managing over 80% of Russia's air cargo traffic. The lockdown of the cargo terminals at Sheremetyevo and Domodedovo, due to the Covert Plan, means that the vital parts needed by Russian industry cannot enter the country. This situation creates a complete supply chain choke. It doesn't take thousands of missing parts to halt an assembly line at an aircraft factory. It's enough for a single electronic control board to be stuck at Moscow customs, waiting in the hold of a cargo plane that can't land. If that board doesn't arrive, that plane doesn't fly. If that sensor doesn't arrive, that tank factory can't produce. This is the genius of Ukraine's asymmetric strategy. Instead of spending millions of dollars on a missile to hit a factory, block the logistics artery that feeds that factory with $500 drones. The result? Even if the factory is physically intact, it will collapse operationally. The ripple effect of this crisis has also spread to financial markets and the insurance sector. There is a harsh mathematical concept in the aviation world called the risk premium. The constant opening and closing of Moscow's airspace places Russia in the status of a high-risk war zone for international aviation insurance companies. Even if Chinese, Turkish, or Arab airlines want to fly to Moscow, insurance companies either cancel their policies or raise premiums to astronomical levels. This means that Russia is isolated not only from the West, but also from the East and South, effectively becoming a no-fly zone. This ban, snorts, has been imposed, not by NATO, but by Russia's own security vulnerabilities and market realities. The Kremlin is helplessly watching the economic collapse of the BRICS bridges it has tried to build through diplomatic channels due to this climate of insecurity in Moscow's sky. The psychological atmosphere created by this vulnerability is shaking not only ordinary citizens, but also the elites, the backbone of the regime. Moscow airports are the gateway to the world for Russian oligarchs, high-level bureaucrats, and generals. In an environment where private jets cannot take off and VIP lounges are unsafe, this untouchable class feels trapped for the first time. The moment your money, power, or connections cannot save you from a drone attack or a delayed flight, is the moment loyalty begins to be questioned. History teaches us that authoritarian regimes begin to crumble when the elite feel we are not safe. Every explosion in the skies over Moscow echoes the question in the minds of the oligarchs. Is it time to abandon ship? This is a silent but deadly wave of panic behind the Kremlin walls. Moreover, the risk of this chaos spreading to Russia's interior regions is a nightmare scenario for the Kremlin. Moscow is Russia's nerve center. Paralysis here affects the nervous system of the entire country, from Vladivostok to Kaliningrad. Delays in airmail, the halting of banking document transfers mean a slowdown in the central government's control over the provinces. In a snort's vast geography like Russia, air transport is not a luxury, but a unifying cement. Ukrainian drones are cracking this cement. As regional governors see that Moscow cannot even ensure its own security, they may lose faith in central authority. This means the straining of the Russian Federation's federal structure and the rise of local initiatives. The weakness of the center accelerates the breakaway of the periphery. Ultimately, this crisis at Moscow airports is not a temporary glitch or a simple operational difficulty. It is concrete evidence of the overstretched capacity of the Russian state. Ukraine has achieved its goal of bringing the war deep into Russia, both physically and psychologically. Moscow's famous aura of invincibility has been crushed under the feet of weary passengers lying on the cold floor of Vnukovo airport. What Putin calls a special military operation has now become for every Russian citizen not the great homeland defense, but the great homeland chaos. The sky is no longer Russia's domain of sovereignty, but a source of uncertainty and fear. And the message from that sky is clear. No matter how high the walls, no matter how secure the palaces, music war is no longer at the door. It is now inside the house. The lights are going out for the Kremlin, and this darkness is not the kind that will dissipate with dawn. It is snorts, the twilight of an empire's collapse. What do you think? Can a nuclear power that cannot keep its own capital's airports open win the war? Let's meet in the comments. Stay with MrWARLOG in pursuit of the truth.